Okay, today is day 7 of the 67 Steps program, and today was one of my favorite topics again, something I've had to deal with in my own life, so I really enjoyed watching this one. It's all about learned helplessness, and Tai starts out with a couple of stories. So one is about this research that was done on dogs, where they shocked the dogs, and the dogs were in a cage, they couldn't escape, and eventually after they keep shocking them and shocking them, they would, realize they can't escape and they just give up and lie down. And so that's kind of a learned helplessness. They're kind of depressed and they just give up. And then when you take those same dogs and you put them in a cage, which is very easy for them to escape, you shock them again. Even though they can get out, they don't, they don't even think about it. They're just so reinforced and trained to be helpless, and they just lie there. And obviously, if you take normal dogs, they don't have that preconditioning. They're just going to jump out of the cage and run away. So there's an interesting analogy to take to humans, and the other example he gave was with monkeys in cages, where, in theory, in a cage they're safer than the wild because the wild has a lot of dangers, a lot of predators, a lot of threats. And in a cage they're going to get fed regularly and looked after in a very safe life, but they're just generally much less happy. And there's studies done on that on the monkeys to show that they experience much less happiness. And then how that applies to humans is kind of the same process that we can be trained and conditioned to accept that helplessness in our lives in different areas of our life. And that can kind of start out with education as one example, where you don't have a very free structure. It's not like the class starts, this is the problem, we need to figure this out, now go out there and try and research and try and find out how to do it. There's a very set, rigid structure for the material you're going to study, what you're going to learn, what the answers are to questions, and so you kind of get used to being force-fed this kind of, education, spoon-fed education process that really takes the creativity out of it and takes the innovation out of it. So we kind of have this feeling of helplessness around education, and maybe that's why so many people don't want to ever read a book or don't want to continue education once they get out of school, because the whole thing was so useless for them. This definitely was one of the things I think I was very frustrated when I was in school. I didn't go to school till I was about 11 years old because I was in a community with my parents who traveled around a lot. So we never had formal schooling until I was about 11, and then I went into normal high school. But for me, it was very difficult to adjust because I just found it so boring. The fact you have to sit still, sit there in class, and study, like this very set formula for studying something, and you can't veer away from that curriculum because you just have to follow what's there, and you have to accept the teacher's, authority, and you can't question anything. So that's not really an education that's going to help you in the real world, because the real world is so full of things you don't understand. You have to know how to ask the right questions, and then how to look for answers, and that's not something you can teach in a textbook. So I had that challenge throughout school and then college, university as well to some degree. But then, he's saying that this helplessness is reinforced in different areas. So school is definitely one area you learn it. And then when you get a job, we're kind of conditioned to be this salary slave. So we're just waiting for that monthly paycheck to come in, and you're kind of just like that monkey in the zoo waiting for the zookeeper to come and feed you your meal, because you just learn that that's how it's done, and you don't. You fall into this trap of just expecting to be paid by someone else. You don't think, how can I make income for myself? We just don't think like that. And obviously that's not taught in school either, right? And they never teach you how can you start to be entrepreneurial and think how to make your own money, much less get any practical experience in that area in school. And then he explains that this school system may have worked for 40, 50 years ago, when you came out and you got a job and you stayed in that job for 40, 50 years, and that job, that company was going to look after you, you get a great retirement, and the whole package was just kind of agreed. That was the done deal. So in exchange for your service, you get this, stable job. You can expect that to be there for you for your whole life. You can raise a family predictably. You can have that. And so that stability was great, but it's actually it's a small blip in the history, as he mentions. It wasn't like that before. I mean, go back 100 years, 200 years, people were hustling in different ways, having some trade that they traded for either for money, or they were farmers, or they had some kind of expertise. So this kind of expectation of a job to be secure, it's just a fallacy, because in today's world there's no jobs out there in the modern world that are so safe and so secure. And so if you fall into that trap of expecting to just live paycheck to paycheck, and for someone always to be there to give you that salary, then you might find a shock when there's a layoff or a recession, and you're kind of very vulnerable to those trends, which lay out thousands of people in an industry, and then suddenly you're competing with a bunch of other people who are also salary slaves, and you're in that situation where it's desperate, and you could have avoided that if you didn't fall into that trap in the first place. So I think that's just a failure of school and society, is that we don't look forward far enough to see how the world is changing, and obviously you look out and see what your parents are doing. Maybe they had stable jobs. Obviously, the teachers have stable jobs, and they're teaching you what they know, so they're not entrepreneurs. So how can you ever expect to get any kind of education to teach you that? And it's just going to reinforce this helplessness that this is just the way the system is. You need to learn to conform. You need to learn to do it the way everyone else is doing it. And if you don't or you can't, then there's something wrong with you, and you're a failure. So, he talks about the division of labor, the fact that we don't make our own clothes anymore, we don't grow our own food, we don't build our computers. The labor is so specialized today that you're so dependent on the system, and that can be a good thing because it can free up your time to do things you enjoy, but at the same time, it may make you feel helpless because you don't understand how things work or how to put things together. So it's not just in wealth that you can feel helpless; it can be in health and diet. The example he gives is that bookstores are full of these diet and health books. It's like the largest bestseller section is full of these health books, and this is just because it reflects how people are feeling. They're feeling out of control with their body and their health, and they're just waiting for that next magic book, with that fix or that pill that's going to save them. And obviously, lasting health comes from a lifestyle. It's not something you can achieve with a 30-day diet that's going to cure you forever. But we're always waiting for that book to come out, that next book, before we actually do anything. And it's just that same thing. We're just lying in that cage, just waiting for something to happen. And obviously, that's learned helplessness. So that's maybe how we're brought up, but obviously it's not something you're stuck in. So he gives an example of why that's such a city trap to fall into, because the risk that we actually have in most of the West, most of the developed world, it's not as scary as it used to be. So he calls it, this jungle. You go out of the 9-to-5 cage into the jungle, into the modern world jungle, and what's really waiting for you there? What's the biggest risk? What's the worst thing that can happen if you take that jump and try and make your own life, make your own income? And there's really, it's not like countries like India where he says, that they have no shelters, no welfare programs. Obviously, it may be slightly different now, but looking back 20 years, how it is in lots of parts of the world, the developing world, where having too much risk can be dangerous because there's nothing there to catch you. So if you go out and start a business and you fail, then you're kind of screwed. And if you really mess up, you can end up on the street starving. But in Europe and US and lots of developed countries, that net is pretty much going to catch you. So you don't have the same risks and the same dangers. If you look at it logically, there's really no reason to take a risk and go out. The worst thing that can happen, for the most part, is you have to go get a job. And this is something I already had to tell myself, because this is an irrational fear that you have, and it just comes from this learned helplessness, and it's reinforced year after year after year of being in a 9-to-5. You get so used to that way of living, and so dependent on that way of living, that anything else is too scary, and you just think, no, it's not for me, I can't do it. And then if you get into a mortgage and you have debt, or you have kids and you have responsibilities, then all those kind of fears can really add up and weigh on your mind and make you think twice before you go and start your own business. But in my case, when I was deciding to quit, I was in a position where I'd been working for 8 years, pretty successful in terms of a corporate career, but just not happy. And I just knew that it was never going to be enough for me, because I'd changed jobs maybe 6-7 times already. I could never stay in a job more than 2 years because I just get bored and I just find it wasn't challenging, it wasn't fulfilling. So I'd gone through that process several times, and I was just thinking, it's not ever going to work for me. So the alternative is I'm going to have to go and find a way to make my own business, make my own money. But I didn't really know what skills I had, and so I knew I had a lot of access to the internet, and so I started finding out how people are making money online, all the different ways you can use, affiliate marketing, all this kind of building a list. And I tried lots of different things until I finally found something that I think, okay, this works, this can add value, and that was helping clients and other businesses with their websites and with their marketing. But I still it wasn't a stable income. I had a bit of knowledge, I had a few ideas how to reach out to clients. I was still studying this stuff as I was trying to practice it. So I wasn't an expert. I didn't have any mentors around me. I didn't know anyone else doing this that I could reach out to, and so I went through very much all of this on my own. And I was doing that while I was in my job. So I kind of got this frustration, and it was just like an itch, and I just couldn't get rid of it, and I had to just keep learning and learning to find out there must be another way. And then when finally I thought I had just enough knowledge, I told myself, okay, look, the worst thing that can happen is You go out on your own, you make it, it doesn't work, you go back and you have to get a job. And I knew I had enough experience, I had enough, ability in the corporate world to go and get another job, and it wasn't going to be an issue. But I didn't have a lot of safety nets because I wasn't in my home country. There's no welfare in Singapore, so you are taking a lot of risk. And I think if I'd had kids, I would have had to really think twice about that. But there was no one else depending on me, so I went out and did it, and it worked out great. So I think that the key is to recognize that most of the developed world, there really is that safety net. The modern jungle is not so scary, and a lot of stuff we tell ourselves is just lies to keep us from taking action, and it's that kind of laziness, because it's a painful thing to have to change that whole part of your lifestyle to really be self-sufficient for your own income. It's much easier to kind of live that hand-to-mouth 9-to-5 lifestyle for a lot of people. They get very used to it, get very comfortable, and that makes you lazy as well. It's not even that you're happy, because if you were happy in your 9 to 5 and you're fulfilled, then you wouldn't really need to change to grow. You could keep growing, but most people in their jobs, you can honestly say most people are not happy. They're just kind of they're just making, getting by, just making it happen and just getting up for work. But they're not like waking up inspired, going to bed, raving to go to work the next day. That's not been my experience in the people I've known. So, we kind of stay in our 9 to 5 cages, and the jungle's out there, and it's just so much opportunity and so little risk compared to how it used to be, that we don't have to really be scared of those things we would have to worry about 50 years ago. And he says, you don't have to jump straight out from a job into your own business. You can do that transition. So kind of like I did, kind of learning on the side, trying out different techniques, just adding to your confidence, adding to your skill set until you have something you can add value to people with. And then, when you feel the time is right, whatever's right for you, you can start either your business and make some money until there's enough money coming in to quit your job, or you can, for me, I thought I'm never going to be able to build this fast enough if I have a really, busy corporate job, and then trying to cut down on my sleep and my weekends to build this business is just not going to go fast enough. So I reached a point where even though I wasn't making that much money, I thought I had to give this a chance, and I was just so pissed off in my job that, I did that. So I think that if you're feeling fulfilled, and there are jobs out there where you can feel fulfilled, then you're very lucky, and it's definitely possible. But you shouldn't get lazy. You shouldn't forget there's other options, and you should always think about where's this job leading to me? What are the progression opportunities? Is it really going to fulfill me, and am I really going to find meaning in this? And ask yourself honestly, what's the best path? So the cage doors, as it says, they're open right now. You can just walk out. It's a much tamer jungle out there, but so many people still stay in the cage and sacrifice their happiness. So that's the world we live in. He gave the example that Donald Trump got into, I think, $9 billion worth of debt. He was still able to work his way out of it. So there's always options. You can declare bankruptcy. You can go back and get a job. If you fail, it's not the end of the world. But if you're too scared to fail, you'll never know what could have been, and then that regret is maybe even a worse place to be in. So the idea is that the jungle represents these risks, and when you take risks, you get rewards, and with that comes the good life. So if you just stay with what is safe and what you know, that's kind of a false economy, because that's sacrificing your potential future happiness. And he suggests to set this 18-month timeline for, a goal that you want to set that's something you can transition into, so you're giving yourself a long enough time frame, and not having to jump straight out and without knowing anything, which is quite scary. And so the question he asks is, where have you been susceptible to saying to yourself, "This is out of my control"? This is very interesting because I think yesterday's video, the day before, was about the difference between rich people and poor people. That poor people always worry about what's outside their control, but rich people worry what's under their control, and that's the difference. So if you link back to this, if you have a feeling you're out of control in your own life, that's also a reason for unhappiness, because they study depressed people, and the thing they find is that they always feel that their life is out of their control, out of their destiny, and so they feel helpless. And I think we all feel that to some degree, but we just don't think about it. We don't explore why, because that really leads to some tough questions. But if you can do that, you ask yourself honestly, where have you been susceptible to saying to yourself, what is out of your control? And what can you do to correct that? How can you start to bridge that gap in terms of learning, in terms of, finding a mentor, finding some way to grow that part of yourself? And the antithesis, or the cure to happiness, is creativity. To helplessness is creativity. And he basically says you can innovate your way out of any problem. So the reason that people are unhappy is they just don't have the innovation, don't have the creativity, and they're not willing to apply themselves. which is maybe a little bit simplistic because it's something we learn, from conditioning that that's the way to be and that's normal. So you really have to get the self-awareness first of all to figure out that that's even a problem before you can change that. Um, and he says if you go back to when you're 14 years old, that's when your mind was the clearest. You don't have the pressure and the stress from life necessarily, but your mind is still, it's grown, it's developed a lot. And you ask yourself, what did you want to do in your career? And if you didn't pursue that, why not? He said he thinks it's typically because you're a victim of a lack of creativity. So that means you didn't know how to innovate to solve this problem, and you just accepted what everyone else is doing, and that's go into a job or go into university or follow the path that everyone else is doing. But if you had that creativity, then the only thing you really need is that practice and that impetus to keep trying, and you can have anything you want. And he gave an example of Arnold Schwarzenegger in the book Total Recall, where it's his life story, and he talks about obviously how Arnold came from a background of poverty and not having any opportunity, no money, no connections, but just being very sure about what he wanted, and just having the drive, having the impetus to not give up. Obviously, he's had a lot of success in his life, and no one's perfect because he's had some failures too. But if you look at where he came from to what he made of himself, you can't argue that there's lessons to be learned there for everyone. And so I'm going to buy that book and I'm going to read through that because I think it's quite an impressive story. And certain aspects of his personality I may disagree with, but the success he's had and the drive he's had, he's motivated a lot of people. He's helped a lot of people, and obviously he's been rewarded for that just by having that consistent drive. So that's what you really need to make it in the modern jungle, is what he says. It's not like you don't have the same threats that we used to have, so you just need to make sure you're not lazy, and that laziness and unreliability is what's going to get you killed in the jungle. But you need to set the right habits and make sure you finish what you start, and that you just have those patterns of consistency to make sure you keep going in the direction, you have the momentum, which we've talked about. He's talked about in previous videos. So he asked, what area have you been helpless in the past, and what would you do differently in hindsight? So for me, definitely career and job has been one of those areas where I just felt helpless. That I've started a job, been really excited, 6 months in, kind of been like, okay, where's this going? After 12, 18 months, I'm like, I'm bored already. Is this all it's going to be? Because the opportunity for promotions there. Maybe I was in too big a company and they don't have that same buzz as a startup where you can really develop very fast, or a small company we can grow and develop very fast. So I was always in these big corporations with these big top-down structures, and it's just very, very easy to fall into a trap and a pattern of just accepting it. But that's always been my challenge of helplessness. Is that I thought I could cure that with getting another job, and then after I got a few more jobs and a few more jobs, I probably should have stopped then and realized that maybe now's a good time to try my own thing. But it took me to get to such a point of desperation and frustration with my job before I took action. And so I felt very helpless, getting stuck in my jobs and going through that feeling of helplessness. It was over and over and over again before I finally did something differently. So in hindsight, probably I would have tried to quit earlier. I ended up spending about 8-9 years in corporate world, and that's not bad at all because of what I learned. But in terms of learning, quicker and faster, where you're feeling helpless, that's probably one area I should have done something differently in hindsight. So this was quite an interesting lesson. I think a lot of the stuff I've applied well in terms of my business, but still there's areas maybe where I'm afraid to jump out of the cage, and so I need to think about, where am I holding myself back in terms of my development, and I think for me it could be being afraid to go back into a 9 to 5 or find a mentorship under someone who I can really learn from, and having the humble attitude to go to someone and say, hey, look, I want to go work for you again. I want to learn what you know. I want you to teach me what you know. And that's maybe, I don't know if that's laziness, but maybe that's pride, and maybe that's one area that I could get past faster if I was more humble. So I don't feel helpless in my business, but sometimes, I think I would grow much faster if I had a mentor, and I felt a bit helpless in that because I wasn't sure where to find a mentor. So when Tai asked what area you've been helpless in the past, maybe it's that process. How do I go and find a mentor? Where do I even speak to these people? And I met a few mentors in the past, but I've not had any real one-to-one or in-face personal mentors in terms of my career or my health. I've just figured everything out from courses, from online mentors, from programs like this, from books. So that's great. We have access to so much information, and that's definitely helped to reduce the feeling of helplessness because you can get some answers online. And in terms of where do you find the people who are having the same challenges as you, so they're going through the same thing, because the worst thing you can have happen is you're going through this feeling of helplessness, and then everyone around you is also feeling helpless. And this is the challenge that happens when you want to change your life, and everyone around you is kind of like, no, 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 you can't do that. Come back to sensible land. Be sensible about this. And that's definitely the challenge most people have when they branch out in a new direction. They quit their job or something. Everyone tells them they're crazy. Their family or their friends are not comfortable because they don't want to think for themselves about their own helplessness, and so they'd rather pull you back down, so that they don't have to question their own assumptions about where their life is and why they're happy or not happy. So this helplessness is all around us. Is one of the biggest challenges. And how do you find people who at least have the awareness to understand that they have those things they need to deal with in order to really have the good life, and they're willing to at least try and tackle it? And where do you find those people? And that's also been, I think I was helpless about that in the past, where I looked around me, I didn't see any entrepreneurs. I wasn't sure where to find these people. I'd never run in those circles. I didn't have friends who were entrepreneurs. And so that was a big challenge for me, that I could only find them online. And in my personal world, in my corporate world, I didn't see any examples of that. And that was very frustrating and made me feel very helpless. That I thought, is these people real? Where are all these people? And as I've gone out into the business world in terms of doing my own business and being an entrepreneur, I've met tons of people. They're all out. They're all out there. You just have to look for them. And so it really is just persistence, and it's having the belief in yourself as much as anything else, because sometimes there's no mentor out there. It's just you, and you have to figure it out, and you have to have the patience and the belief in yourself that there's answers there. So anyway, that's some of the things I've learned and had to go through. So now I'm lucky. There's tons of entrepreneurs around. I can reach out to people. Any city in the world I travel to, there's networks I can plug into. There's people I can go see, and I'm reminded all the time. There's all these people out there doing on the same journey, trying to make a better life for themselves, finding that time freedom again, and just really going for it and not letting their pain hold them back or their helplessness hold them back. And so if you're thinking that it's helpless, it's really just, most of the time it's a learned response, something you've picked up, some conditioning. You need to learn to let that go. So something to think about. But yeah, really enjoyed today's class, and I'll be back tomorrow with more.